So, again, thank you guys so much for being here tonight. Thank you so much for watching. And if you would like to support this show, a great way to do that is to join my locals community. There, you become a monthly subscriber. It helps support the show. It's really absolutely fundamental to the survival of the show, and I absolutely appreciate it. You go there, you become a member of my community. You will not only receive, not only will you be supporting the show, but you'll also be receiving behind the scenes content, just kind of my daily life. I kind of give you a glimpse into my personal life a bit, but also behind the scenes content that is going to be rolling out more, not behind the scenes content, excuse me. You'll get behind the scenes footage of my personal life, but you're also going to receive exclusive content that is not anywhere else. So that is my thoughts on certain things, little or smaller segments that I don't feel like I can upload on some other platforms. Maybe they're, they would be censored or whatnot. So all of that stuff is in my locals community. Plus, you can interact with one another. You can post content as well. If you want to share a story or a video or a link or research or anything, you are able to also post there as well. So it's a community. And that link is down below, and I really absolutely appreciate it. So that is the best way to support the channel and also to get something for that support that you're giving to the channel. All right. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the current conflict with Israel and Palestine. Now, I haven't looked at the news just as of, within the last hour. So if something has changed, let me know. But at this juncture, the fighting is still going. There is no ceasefire. And what I understand is that Israel has rejected any ceasefire request by Egypt, including a short 12-hour ceasefire. So Egypt tried to broker a ceasefire deal. They were unable to get to one. Hamas apparently was going to agree to it, but the Israelis said no. And that leads us to kind of a question: why wouldn't the Israelis want to go ahead and at least invoke a short 12-hour ceasefire? What is their motivation to continue pummeling Gaza and the West Bank, but in particular Gaza, and continuing to kill numerous people, including women, children, and medical professionals like doctors? Hamas, in all of this, has been very clear about what they want. They have a short list of demands, and they're not really that unreasonable if you think about it. They're asking for all of the Israeli troops to leave the religious site of Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. That is the mosque in Jerusalem that is built on what the Israeli Jews call Temple Mount. So it is where Abraham, historically, biblically, or according to the Torah, was going to sacrifice his son. And if you're Jewish, you believe the son was Israel. And if you are, Isaac. And if you are Muslim, you believe that it was Ishmael. And that site is extremely important to both religions. Currently on that site is a big mosque and a big mosque compound. And that is the source of a lot of the contention that goes on in Jerusalem and in just the conflict in general, is over that particular religious site, that because Muslims have been in the region for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, there's a mosque there. And so Hamas is demanding that the troops leave Al-Aqsa Mosque, that they allow the Muslims there to pray in peace. Now, the Israelis say, no, we think that they're harboring terrorists in this site. Now, remember, Gazians cannot get out of Gaza. So there are no Gazians hiding at Al-Aqsa Mosque. They have no access to Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's no way for them to be there. Hamas is not there. Maybe there are some Hamas, there's definitely people in the West Bank who support Hamas. But we're not talking about the same group of people. So the people that are fighting in Gaza are not running off to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and hiding. They can't get to it. They're completely isolated away from it. So, but Hamas is demanding that the Israeli troops leave the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and allow the Muslims there to pray in peace. They also want the evictions to halt in Sheikh Jarrah, which is the neighborhood that is going through this, what they're calling a private land dispute. This is the land dispute where there's some two Jewish organizations that claim that they have a deed to that land from the late 1800s when it was purchased back from, their ancestors purchased it in the 1800s and they believe that's their land. However, there was a period of time when the Jordanians had captured that land. It was under their occupation, and they built for the refugee Palestinians who were shoved out of their land in 1948 when the Israelis won the first war. They evicted 700,000 Palestinians from what is now modern day Israel. And they moved these people who had lived in these homes for hundreds of years. They demolished those homes. They built what now is Israel. And those people fled. When those people fled, the Jordanians and also various different humanitarian organizations gave them some land to build on because they needed places to live. They had just gotten evicted very forcefully, aggressively, and suddenly. And so now that neighborhood is under dispute. These groups have been trying to get these people out of that area since the 70s. And after the 1967 war, they were trying to get them out. They were saying, hey, now we have control over all of Jerusalem, because prior to 1967, the Israelis did not. It was separated and each side controlled a piece of Jerusalem. After 1967, the Israelis controlled all of it. And after that point, they were more empowered to then start saying, hey, a bunch of this land is ours. And they showed some deeds. They said this is ours according to these deeds from the 1800s. And the courts and the international community have not granted any, sort of granted it in the 70s. They said, well, okay, fine, you can own it, but you can't evict these people. So now these people are not technically any more owners of this land. Now they're tenants of the land. And so now they're going to have to pay you rent. And so these people have been paying rent. And now these Jewish organizations who technically own the deed to the land say they want these people totally gone. So they view it as a private land dispute. That's how they view it. They say, hey, this is a private land dispute. A private organization owns that land, and these Palestinians don't belong there and they need to go. The Palestinian viewpoint is, you stole my home once, and now we were allowed to build homes on this land, and actually they built the homes for us, the Jordanian government and various humanitarian organizations, and now you're wanting to get us off this land again. Haven't you taken enough? That is the Palestinian standpoint. So Hamas is saying they don't want these people to be evicted from Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And Hamas is demanding that all of the protesters related to these events be released from jail. Now, Israel has a habit, because Palestinians are under military occupation, there is really no due process for them. This is why, in my mind, there is a dispute on whether or not this is apartheid versus military occupation. They are still very much living under the rules of military occupation. This could change and it could become apartheid. I don't think it's quite there yet. I do think it's all really bad. And I do believe that the Palestinians absolutely should have their own sovereign nation. And apartheid would kind of imply that they should all be one nation. I'm not quite there yet. We can have that disagreement. Many people do. But one of the issues with military occupation is there's really no rules. And they can change anytime they want. There's no laws of the land. The laws are military laws. And whatever the military decides at that moment is the new law by military order. So they're able to hold people, Palestinians, for an indefinite amount of time without even pressing charges against them. They can just hold them. And they do this regularly. It's extremely disruptive to family life. It's extremely disruptive to the ability for people to hold jobs and pay rent and get an education. It's really extremely debilitating. And we know this because we know Joe Biden did that when he did the 1994 crime bill and tore up black families in America. We know that the ripping out of these black fathers from the homes left families completely in chaos and struggling. And that strategy that we saw for a period of time happening to black Americans has been happening for decades to the Palestinians. And it still happens to this day. And they say, well, it's because of security reasons. You know, they always give that excuse. Well, security reasons. That's why we're rounding you up. That's why we're taking you away. And that's why we're not going to tell you when we're letting you out. So Hamas is demanding that they release these protesters. And they're demanding that they remove the troops from Al-Aqsa. They demand that they halt the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. That honestly all sounds pretty reasonable. Hamas isn't asking for a lot there. But the Israelis have rejected this. Egypt has attempted to try to reason with the Israelis to halt the the warfare that is going on and really, quite frankly, war crimes. And the Israelis are rejecting it. And a lot of people should stop and ask why. Why are the Israelis not so willing to negotiate? And yet Hamas, the terrorist organization, is. It doesn't sound like Hamas is operating like a terrorist organization at this moment when they're asking for pretty reasonable demands. And the Israelis instead are saying, screw you, we're just going to continue to bomb your schools, your mosques, your hospitals, or roads to hospitals. And we're going to continue to do this, and your media outlets. And, I think people are kind of stopping and wondering, how fair is this? What is really going on here? So far, the death toll in Gaza has reached 212. Last I checked, again, like I said, I haven't seen the news in the last hour or so maybe things have changed. Hopefully not. But so far, the death toll in Gaza has reached 212, including 61 children. That is 1/3 of these deaths are children, about 1/3. And, or did I not do the math? Yeah. So it's about a little under 1/3, and 36 women, including some doctors and other medical professionals, are amongst the dead. Also in the West Bank, the death toll is now 15 Palestinians. In Israel, the death toll is 10, including 2 children. So this is not, I would say, level, right? In any stretch of any imagination. This certainly doesn't look like it's proportionate warfare. And 212 dead compared to 10 is exponential. Now, the Israelis say, and what they've been doing is they've been targeting media buildings. We saw that the Israelis blew up the building that housed AP and Al Jazeera, as well as some other news outlets. The day before, they blew up another news building that housed over a dozen media outlets, domestic and foreign. And they blew up 2 media buildings. They've shot areas around schools, mosques, and they're dropping bombs via overhead air raids, right? They're flying warplanes over Gaza, and they're dropping these bombs near mosques, schools. They're blowing up roads to hospitals, preventing ambulances from taking the wounded to the hospitals. And the civilian casualty is enormous. Look, like a lot of times in military warfare, they'll say things like, well, there's going to be some collateral damage. But this looks to be all collateral damage. It doesn't look like there's much in the way of Hamas being killed out of these 212 at all. Maybe a dozen out of the 212, but that is a lot of collateral damage. And the same goes for the Israelis, the death toll being 10, including 2 children. This is unacceptable. All of it is absolutely unacceptable. These are civilians. They are not the ones who are waging the warfare. They're not the ones who are in the middle of, they're not running the government of Israel. That is important to remember. The Israeli citizens are not running their government. They, of course, can vote and have a say, but a lot of them are very against everything that's going on. And the Palestinian people, they're not all Hamas. So Israel does all of this stuff, and they say that, Hamas uses these people as shields. They're using them as shields, and that's despicable. That's animalistic. That's on Hamas. They also say that, we had to blow up these mosques and schools and roads to hospitals because that's where the tunnels are. That's where the tunnels are, they say. But we know that those tunnels lead somewhere else, right? That's what a tunnel is. So if a tunnel leads from a school to someplace else, why couldn't you bomb the someplace else? If the tunnel goes from a mosque to someplace else, then bomb the someplace else. If it goes from roads to a hospital to someplace else, then bomb someplace else. It doesn't make any sense to be targeting these schools and these mosques and these roads to hospitals to prevent the injured from getting any help. Adding to the death toll. It's absolutely inhumane. And more people are waking up to this. And especially the fact that when Israel says, we just do this because they're using them as a shield, and that's what it is. Let me find for you, where did I put this? Here, I want to show you this article actually that shows that when the Israelis claim, here it is. So this is an article from 2007, okay? And this was, again, when Israel was bombing Lebanon and they said, well, Hezbollah was using the citizens for shielding. They were using, what were we supposed to do? We're sorry that all these citizens died, but, Hezbollah was using them as shields. And this report shows from Human Rights Watch that was actually bullcrap, that wasn't true. Now, they accuse everybody of doing this. It's a way to easily get out of owning up to the fact that you're targeting civilians and you're trying to make life as terrifying as possible so that they give up, so that they say, okay, no more. We call mercy. So here it is, says Israel, Lebanon, Israeli indiscriminate attacks killed most civilians. No evidence of widespread Hezbollah shielding. And there's also, by the way, no evidence of Hamas shielding with these kids or these civilians. We're not seeing images that, by the way, maybe we would see more if Israel didn't target actual media buildings and try to blow up media companies and all of their equipment. Maybe we would see images of Hamas militants out there holding little children and saying, come get me. We're not seeing any of this. We're just not. And they're saying, well, they're using them as shields. Again, they're not. It's that the tunnels, yes, maybe the tunnels went near, but the tunnels go somewhere else. So bomb somewhere else. So it says right here, Israel's indiscriminate airstrikes, not Hezbollah's shielding as claimed by Israeli officials, caused most of the approximately 900 civilian deaths in Lebanon during the July-August 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. Human Rights Watch said in a report released today that they investigated more than 500 deaths. Now, again, this was from 2007. It says, quote, Israel wrongfully acted as if all civilians had heeded its warning to evacuate southern Lebanon when it knew they had not, disregarding its continuing legal duty to distinguish between military targets and civilians. Right? They have a legal duty to distinguish between military targets and civilians. So they said issuing warnings does not make indiscriminate attacks lawful. Now, again, they gave the AP 1 hour. They said, get out, 1 hour. You got 1 hour. Get out of the building. We're going to bomb it. So they found here that the 249-page report called Why They Died, Civilian Casualties in Lebanon During the 2006 War says that they investigated 94 cases of air, artillery, and ground attacks by the Israel Defense Forces to discern the circumstances surrounding the deaths of 510 civilians, 51 combatants, nearly half at least of the 1,109 Lebanese deaths during the conflict. Of the approximately 510 Lebanese civilian deaths investigated, at least 300 were women or children. Human Rights Watch visited more than 50 Lebanese villages and interviewed 316 victims and eyewitnesses, as well as 39 military experts, journalists, Israeli, Lebanese government, and Hezbollah officials. So they said that they found that the simple movement of vehicles or persons, such as attempting to buy bread or moving about a private home, could be enough to cause a deadly Israeli strike that would kill civilians. They're like, oh, we see some movement there, so go get them. They said Israeli warplanes also targeted more moving vehicles that turned out to be carrying only civilians trying to flee the conflict. And this is what they were doing. I am sorry, but if you have one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world to the point where you can actually, for one, blow rockets right out of the sky, which is all the defense you need. So it is not excusable to say, well, we're just trying to defend ourselves. You have an Iron Dome. Your Iron Dome does a pretty good job. You are defending yourself quite well. So they have a sophisticated enough military to have something like an Iron Dome. They're able to actually see where they're targeting so well that they claim they can see the underground tunnels. So if they can see the underground tunnels, then they surely could see that there are children running around in those homes that they're about to bomb. Surely they could see that. So we're not going to buy that these are collateral damage because Hamas, these terrorists, are using them as human shields. There's no evidence of that. There was no evidence that Hamas was using the media buildings to launch rockets from. There's no evidence that they were in the buildings at all. AP is angry. They're demanding an answer from Netanyahu. He has come out and said, well, there was some Hamas intelligence happening in your building. That's what it was. Hamas intelligence. And AP says, we don't have any evidence of that. Show us the receipts. We want to know. Where are you getting this information? Show us. And they have yet to do it. They're not doing it. Joe Biden, what is Joe Biden doing about all of this? After all, Israel would absolutely listen to the United States. They don't listen to anybody else. They do listen to the U.S. And so what does the U.S. have to say about all of this? When all of the international community is calling for a ceasefire, telling Israel to back off, telling Hamas to back off, calling for a ceasefire. Today in a call with Netanyahu, Biden expressed his support for a ceasefire and told Mr. Netanyahu that the U.S. would keep working with Egypt and other countries to achieve one. So it was a real soft, we support a ceasefire if you're going to do it. In fact, Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, said, in all of these engagements, we have made clear that we are prepared to lend our support in good offices to the parties should they seek a ceasefire, Blinken said. So they're basically saying if Israel wants a ceasefire, we support it. We are on the side of Israel, and that's it. That's all. We don't care what the international community says. We don't care that Hamas is willing to have a ceasefire. Well, we're supporting whatever Israel wants to do. And if Israel wants to blow up children, we support it. So far, Israeli forces have struck 766 targets in the Gaza Strip. 766. Again, they have an Iron Dome, right? So this Iron Dome is blowing the rockets right out of the sky. When they say that they have the right to defend themselves, they do have the right to defend themselves, but they don't have a right to go on the offense and commit massacres of people in what they call mowing the grass. So this is a military strategy that Israel has been using for a long time. Here's an article about it. This was actually from a couple of years ago, called Mowing the Grass and the Forced Casualty Trade-Off, Israel's predictable response to the Gaza protests. And it's predictable again. They're doing it again. They're mowing the grass again. It says right here, Israel's military response resulting in now this was a couple of years ago, Israel's military response resulting in around 40 Palestinian deaths and some 5,000 injuries has drawn international censure, though Israel claims to be responding to imminent threats to its security orchestrated by Hamas. So they always say this, imminent threats to our security orchestrated by Hamas, despite the fact they have an Iron Dome that does all the work for them. It says, far from an aberration, the only thing novel about the current clashes is their design. Goes on here. To combat these two adversaries, talking about Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel has adopted a policy of mowing the grass, a patient military strategy of attrition with limited goals to diminish their opponent's capacity to harm Israel and to accomplish temporary deterrence, both of which are achieved through occasional large-scale operations as seen with the 3 Gaza wars and the Second Lebanon War. Over time, it is hoped that the repeated achievement of these limited goals will drain the motivation of enemy fighters to harm Israel and eventually cause the movement to fizzle out into obscurity. Israel does not seek Hamas's overthrow. It is content with the status quo in which the Palestinian national movement is divided physically and politically between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It also does not believe Hamas can be totally eradicated militarily. I don't even know what that word means. I got to look it up. Nor accommodated politically. As Amos Oz has written, Hamas is not just a terrorist organization. Hamas is an idea, and no idea has ever been defeated by force. Israel's goals are thus limited by necessity as much as choice. Also involved in the agenda of mowing the grass are various preventative actions which can take place either during or in between periods of hot war. These have included a number of airstrikes on weapons, convoys before they reach Hezbollah or other groups, in addition to targeted assassinations of prominent leaders or weapons experts, which is what we saw with the taking out of Soleimani. The United States did that, but in cahoots with Israel. So mowing the grass is a strategy. What it is they don't care that Hamas is willing to agree to a ceasefire. They don't want to do the ceasefire because they're in the middle of something. So they're saying, oh, yeah, we hear you about that whole ceasefire thing, but we're in the middle of something here. We're trying to debilitate you completely. So they're using it as an opportunity to try and blow up as much infrastructure as possible in Gaza to keep Hamas busy. So what they want to do is they want to keep Hamas having to build roads to the hospitals, having to rebuild schools, having to rebuild mosques, having to deal with all of rebuild buildings and try to deal with housing, having to deal with the water issues now that they're having because they've been blowing all this stuff up, the fuel issues they have, on top of already having very limited electricity. They only get electricity like 4 hours a day in Gaza. So on top of all these infrastructure issues that the people already suffer from, this is intended by design to make them suffer more. Imagine how upset we get about U.S. sanctions, right? We get really mad about U.S. sanctions on other countries. We believe those are acts of war. When you debilitate a country economically and you make it to where people don't have access to basic necessities, or that you try to collapse their currency. We've seen this happen in Iran and in Venezuela. It's an act of war. It's an abuse. It causes deaths, collateral damage. That is when you're trying to target a government and instead you're going after the civilian population. Now, this is leveling that up. This is going from not just sanctioning, but now you're actually going to blow it up. Physically, literally, you're going to blow it up. And that is going to keep them using all of their resources, what little they have, on rebuilding those items of infrastructure, keeping things, access to essentials limited. This is anteing up the ball game of just sanctioning a government. This is, and it is obviously a total act of war, but they're doing it very specifically in a targeted way. They have an agenda. So when Israel feels like they have done enough, when they feel like, okay, how long is this going to take for Hamas to rebuild? Is this going to take them a couple of years? If it's going to take them 2, 3, 4 years, then okay, we've done enough now. And then they'll say, okay, we now agree to a ceasefire. But they're not agreeing to the ceasefire until they get that point. No matter what Hamas says, no matter what Hamas does, Israel has an agenda right now, and that is to blow as much of Gaza up as possible, to debilitate Hamas, keep the people fractured, keep the people suffering, keep the people in a tailspin. And this also prevents the Gazians from being able to build up the infrastructure to live normal lives. So there's a lot of criticism against the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority as well, not just Hamas and Gaza, but also the Palestinian Authority running the West Bank. There's a lot of criticisms of them saying, well, if they want, clean water, then if they want to have running water every day, because they don't have running water every day. They say, well, if they want to have running water every day, then maybe they should actually spend some money on building infrastructure. Well, it's really hard to progress when you're constantly being blown up and you're constantly being reeled back. That doesn't allow you to build the water infrastructure that is modern when you're just trying to get a basic water infrastructure built because you blew it up. Same thing in the Palestinian Authority. Even though in the West Bank they're not necessarily blowing it up, they don't issue them the permits. They tell the people that are trying to build the water infrastructure, sorry, but you don't have the permit and we're not giving you the supplies. And they certainly don't give the supplies to the Gazians. They don't give them the supplies because they say, we're afraid you're going to use these supplies to build weapons. So that is the game. I mean, the game is against the Palestinian people in both the Gaza Strip and also in the West Bank, is to keep them as hindered as possible from growth, from advancing, from gaining knowledge. So they shut down the schools, from gaining resources, from having living fruitful lives. There's no jobs in Gaza. There are few jobs in the West Bank. People are suffering from high rates of unemployment. That happens also, by the way, with even the Arab communities inside of Israel. The Arabs that are actual Israeli citizens have a very difficult time finding employment. You could imagine. They're discriminated against heavily in a state that declares itself a Jewish nation. If you are not Jewish, you're going to have a difficult time. And so these Arabs that are inside of Israel have a very difficult time finding employment. And yet the finger is pointed at these groups and they're told, well, it's your own fault. It's your fault, Gaza, that you don't have advanced water systems and advanced electrical systems that allow you to have electricity all hours of the day and running water and access to good medicines and hospitals. It's your fault. Well, hard to do when you're blowing things up, and it's hard to do when you won't even let supplies in because you're afraid they're going to use it for weapons. And by the way, when things were peaceful, what happened? Well, the Israelis came in and built settlements. So, and they take, right? They control the water, they control everything. Same thing in the West Bank. They say, well, it's your fault that you don't have any of these advancements. But the Israelis control everything. They control the permits to build. They control the supplies, the supply chain. They control everything. And then the Arabs inside of Israel, they say, oh, it's your own fault. You can't live a better life and you live in the slums. Well, it's difficult if you're not given opportunities like a job. So all of it is, it's there to, it's this hamster wheel, essentially. Even when the complaint is legitimate, it's still a hamster wheel. And so when you keep people oppressed, they're only going to radicalize more. And then as they radicalize, you say, see, you're a terrorist. And then they do something to defend themselves because they're trapped. And then it's this cycle. It's just this horrible, horrible cycle. And the only way to get out of this cycle is if the Israelis drastically change their strategy towards how they engage with the Palestinians. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, what about the Palestinians? They're just not the ones in the position of power. So it really does have to be the bigger and the stronger one that has to say, okay, we are going to have a different strategy with you. And the fact of the matter is, Israel would be better and the world would have a lot more sympathy for Israel if they did just kind of stand back and take the rocket attacks. Now you might say, oh, Kim, what? Take the rocket attacks? Iron Dome, guys. They have an Iron Dome. That Iron Dome is blowing out of the sky thousands of rockets, obliterating them. The Israeli people have bunkers. They can go and hide. They've got a lot of these things. I know it's disruptive to life. I know it's horrible. But what's horrible is retaliation in a way that just looks like absolute, it's atrocious. The retaliation is atrocious. The revenge they take out on the Gazians is atrocious. And that's not even a strong enough word for it. So they would have more sympathy from the world if they just allowed the rockets, they just beefed up their Iron Dome and just continued to play defense and have the right to defend themselves. Yes, they have the right to blow the rockets right out of the sky, and they do. So if they just continued to do that, that would be a good start, and not going in and bombing and creating chaos. And they could then say, look, we are not aggressive at all. We're just trying to live peacefully. But that's not what this looks like to any of us. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for even Israelis themselves or Americans who really, really support the state of Israel to deny what is going on, right? It's becoming increasingly difficult. And it used to be where they would give you a good argument, you'd try to have a discussion about it, but now it's just, oh, you're an anti-Semite, you hate Israel. And it's like, no, the two are not the same at all. They become synonymous as a defense, but they're not. So they're really losing favor in the world, and that is not a good thing for Israel. If Israel wants to secure its future, it can't only just think of the Gazians and the Palestinians that are there and the Arab nations that are surrounding them. They also need to start thinking about their PR for the entire world, their image around the world. They get a ton of support from the United States because the United States has the largest Jewish population in the world by a lot. And then second is Israel. And then after that, there's not very many around the world. So you don't have a big voting base in all of these other countries or lobbies in all these other countries that are trying to buy off politicians or politicians that feel like they need to pander to certain demographics in order to keep themselves in office. That is not really a thing anywhere else in the world. So besides the United States being a staunch ally of Israel, and of course, there's a lot of other countries that are allies because the United States says do so or else. That is going to change as the U.S. loses its stature in the world. And when that day comes, Israel will be in an extremely vulnerable position unless Israel makes a change. And there are a lot of organizations out there. There's a great lobbying organization called J Street that is gaining a lot of influence in our politics. There's a real push inside of the more liberal leftist Jewish community to make change, to make significant change. And they support, Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, and Elizabeth Warren and numerous others. And they really advocate for a two-state solution with a shared Jerusalem, a shared capital of Jerusalem, and funding for both the Israeli government or the Israeli people, the nation of Israel, and also the Palestinians. They advocate for this. They want an actual peaceful solution to this, not a fake one like Jared Kushner and all that, a real one. So another interesting thing about this is China, they're getting involved here. They want to broker a ceasefire, and they say that the U.S. needs to stop obstructing that ceasefire. Now, right now, China is the rotating chair of the Security Council. There's a United Nations Security Council, and each term there's a new chair, and China's the chair right now. They just took the chair this month, I believe. And they're calling for an immediate de-escalation in one unified statement. They want to issue a United Nations Security Council statement calling for a ceasefire. And the U.S. is saying, oh, count us out of that. Calling for a ceasefire. I mean, how ridiculous is this? So China says, quote, we urge the U.S. to shoulder its fair share of responsibilities, take a just stance, and work with the majority of the international community to support the Security Council in playing its due role in easing the situation, rebuilding trust, and advancing political settlement. That is what China issued a statement today. So that is where we're at with this conflict right now, is just this... Israel is mowing the grass, and the Palestinian people are paying a horrible, horrible price. And look, there are definitely extremists on both sides. There's also a large number of Israelis and Arabs who are all wanting peace. And but the big issue is, even if they're not going to find peace, even if that's a pipe dream right now, even if that is, it's just not really in the cards because there's just too many extremists on both sides, there at least needs to be measured responses to Hamas and a measured response in the West Bank. And what Israel is doing is by no means measured. And I think everybody can see that. It's becoming harder to deny. And when is all this going to stop? When is all this going to stop? That is the big question many of us have. So thank you guys so much for watching this. If you would like to support this channel, again, the best way to do that is to join my Locals community. That link is down below. There you will not only be supporting the show and the independent nature of the show, but you'll also be getting behind the scenes content and exclusive content as well. So be sure to sign up for my Locals community. That link is down below.